So let's talk through the new Codex for 40k's race of cloned and AI-augmented space dwarves in the 10th edition rulebook for the Leagues of Votann. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Leagues of Votann, and in this video we're doing a full summary of their Codex, looking at the rules for their new units and different detachments. In 10th edition so far, I feel like the Leagues haven't had too bad a time of it, after a very rocky start, perhaps being the single worst army in the game for a little bit. Games Workshop did manage to right the ship a bit, giving them more powerful army rules and discounted points cost on a bunch of their units. With a fairly small roster and some good damage dealing stratagems, they've since been a solidly mid-tier army for Warhammer 40k. Maybe not too many sneaky tricks, but lots of good damage and defense, and all their units being at least usable. I think people were ready to have some things to change up the formula a bit though, and this Codex adds in a bunch of new detachments and massively expands their roster. They've got a full 8 more units, and hopefully it could add a bit more variety and different ways to play your space dwarves in-game. At time of recording, it's not so very long before the Codex goes live. If you're looking to pick up the new book or any of the new kits, the video sponsor and Toy Snowman could help you out if you're in Canada. They have Games Workshop's things at 15% off. Plenty of other places around in the rest of the world though. Element Games in the UK, Gap Games in Australia, Wargame Portal in the USA, and Tash and Geldeep in the EU. Here are the pre-order times between Friday nights to Saturday morning. Those links can save a little bit versus Games Workshop, and of course a big thank you to any people using the ones in the video description. They do help support Auspex Tactics and the videos I make. Let's jump into the contents of the Codex though, and like other 40k codexes, this has got all the stuff you'd expect. A lore section and plenty of miniature galleries, crusade content for the leagues, and then the combat patrol rules for the new one with the Ironkin Hearthguard and the Brokir Thunderkin in. For this review I'm going to be focusing on the core rules though. They have a new core mechanic called Prioritised Efficiency, yield points, and 2 army rules replacing their system of judgment tokens that they had before, and it features heavily in the detachments. There's 5 different detachments, each with their own themes. They all have their main core rule, 4 enhancements and 6 stratagems. There's 1 general purpose one, the other 4 being at least somewhat associated with certain datasheets. The datasheet roster has expanded a bit. There's now 21 datasheets in the Codex, where previously there were 13. There's 8 new datasheets for their 6 new plastic kits, due to a couple of them having variants of war gear. It certainly feels like a lot more of a well-rounded roster compared with what they had previously. While they got at least a fairly solid first release wave, you could tell that they were a fair bit behind the majority of factions in Warhammer 40k. There are points costs in the Codex that we'll talk about as we go along, though I'd bear in mind that the official ones of those will be out via a digital download, and I will cover those on the channel when we get them. Wasting no time, let's jump straight into it, and their core rule is Prioritised Efficiency. This one replaces their 9th and 10th edition systems of Ruthless Efficiency and Judgment tokens, and it maybe does feel a little bit sad. I feel like that was quite evocative with the whole Dwarven Book of Grudges, with the king getting angry at certain units and then laying them low. I feel like updating it in some way wasn't the worst idea though. It maybe was just a little bit boring, particularly in the 10th edition version, where it basically only works because they had a band-aid patch, which meant that you basically just got 4 units automatically judgment marked at the start of the game. And it just meant that it wasn't really very interactive, just flat better damage against the enemy's toughest stuff normally. And it maybe might not have been the best thing to balance in terms of unit damage output. It meant that the Leagues of Votann have very strong damage against the judgment mark targets, but kind of weirdly weak against other ones. The new rule more focused on the theme of ruthless acquisition, generally fighting for gain or prospects as opposed to glory. So the rule quite heavily focuses around objective markers, which I'm guessing in the sort of headcanon of 40k is the loot that they want to make off with. In any case, the general gist of Prioritised Efficiency is that you generate yield points over the course of a game, and then you use your yield score to determine your army rule at the end of your command phase. If you have anywhere between 0 and 6 yield points, you get Hostile Acquisition as your army rule until your next command phase, and if you have 7 or more, then instead you get the Fortified Takeover army rule. Focusing on the yield points themselves first, these are generated in both players' command phases, so you basically generate them once in your turn and then your opponent's, so they at least have the potential to rack up quite quickly. You get 1 for holding your home objective, and then up to 3 more bonus ones, 1 for holding at least 1 objective marker not within your deployment zone during that command phase, 1 for holding at least 2 not within your deployment zone, and 1 for holding more objective markers than your opponent currently does. For the ones that are in your own command phase, you do your yield point accounting before checking which of the army abilities that you use. There's really quite a lot of mechanics that allow you to manipulate or allow you to spend yield points. The Memnyr Strategist can increase or decrease the amount that you have, and quite a lot of the stratagems in the book or the enhancements use them as a resource, so they're basically going to be an extra thing to keep track of on top of command points. I feel like it is going to make the Leagues of Votann a bit more of a resource-intensive faction, where you basically have to track two different scores and both think about the interplay of the core rule with what you can do by spending the yield points for specific stratagems and units. If you just let them tick up and are having at least some presence on the primary objectives, it seems very likely that you get to fortified takeover before the third command phase though. In any case, for the two special rules themselves, Hostile Acquisition is in theory the early game one, and this one gives you a damage buff against units on objectives. You get to add +1 to the hit roll, basically army-wide against enemy units within range of objective markers, and then you also get to reroll advance and charge rolls for every unit on the board. Both of those are good buffs. Lots of enemy units are going to be having to stand on objectives to score their primary points, though obviously it won't trigger literally all the time. And re-rolling advanced and charges helps you get around the board faster, and quite nice not to have to spend points on command point re-rolls for say some Chthonian Berserks failing a key charge at one point. Then when you get to 7 or more at the end of a command phase, you move on to Fortified Takeover. This one gives you a +1 to your hit rolls whenever your unit is within range of an objective that you control. And on top of that, all your units have a -1 to wound if the enemy's strength is greater than your toughness, or at least all of your units besides vehicle targets, so it doesn't work on your Sagittars and land fortresses and things. You can sort of see the logic to it, the idea being that you try and take objectives in the early game and then hold them in the later game. I think in reality though, in any one turn, you might prefer the one rule or the other, or some armies might just like the one of them as often as they can get it, and sometimes which one you might prefer might vary on the detachment as well. Some detachments have benefits for being in one or the other, like certain stratagems that you can only use in one of them. Overall, I would say it looks like a more interesting mechanic compared with judgment tokens. They were a bit simplistic, even if they did have a good feel to them. At first impressions, this one maybe feels a little bit less fun of a theme, even if it's on brand for them. It could be one that your opponent at least has a bit of control over, whether or not they put units on objective markers, and whether or not they contest ones from you. It would mean just a little bit more bookkeeping, as it's another thing to track the counter of alongside command points, and it's certainly not too uncommon for people to get that wrong. In terms of army rule overall power, it feels maybe a tiny bit less powerful, but not by loads. I think it would genuinely vary quite heavily on what game that you are playing. In a game where you're playing against lots of big tough enemy units like Knights or Custodies, probably Judgment tokens would have done you better with a +1 to wound against some serious targets. If you're playing against some Eldari or something, then having big +1s to wound on fragile units wasn't really the best thing in the world, so this would likely be better there. I think it does have enough stuff to be interesting though. Moving on from the core rule to the detachments, there's 5 detachments in total. Now, these are fairly typical detachments as 40k goes. A core rule, 4 enhancements and 6 stratagems. 1 general purpose one, and then 4 of the rest, generally theming around one subclass of units within the Codex. The detachments in question are the Needgaârd Oathband. This one basically feels like an overhauled version of the standard Oathband from the Index. Very similar stratagems, though a few of the mechanics tweaked around as it interplayed with judgment tokens quite a lot. Then there's the Dêlve Assault Shift, that's themed around Chthonian Berserkers mining onto the battlefield and charging the enemy. The Persecution Prospect is the Ironkin Scouting Unit focus, all about firepower and pinning the enemy. The Brandfast Oathband is the transport-focused one, with Sagittars and land fortresses being the order of the day, and the Hearthfyre Arsenal is the Ironkin and Brockhir unit themed, unleashing experimental and dangerous weapons on the foe. They'll also get access to the Hearthband as well. That was the Grotmus detachment that was themed around the Ironhir Hearthguard. Typically that one hasn't really been played all that much and has been fairly overshadowed prior to now. And I will be kind of surprised if that one takes off too much post-Codex. It doesn't look like the Ironhir Hearthguard got stronger unless they get really quite a big points cut. As ever with 40k detachments, none of them look at any units, though as per normal some detachments support some datasheets far more than others. To start with, let's talk about some angry Chthonian Berserkers with punchy melee weapons and have a look at the Dêlve Assault Shift. The idea behind this one is a sort of Chthonian Berserk assault they might practice against enemy ships, Berserks drilling below the enemy hull or using close range teleporters to get into the action, and as a result the Berserk units gain deep strike and battle line. It means that you can take really quite a lot of them, and then they can basically just teleport onto the board. Chthonian Berserk certainly look like an interesting unit. They've got a very scary punchy, strength 5, damage 3, and have anti-vehicle and anti-monster 3+ keywords with those concussion mauls. It just looks like they're pretty general purpose and scary against anything. Going heavy on them doesn't seem like the worst idea in the world. Deep strike is only so good a way to get them into melee though, even with a command point reroll or the army rule. Going with hostile acquisition, it means that you have less than a 50% chance of getting into melee from a 9-inch charge, and particularly with Berserks being kind of fragile, it doesn't usually make sense just to deep strike them next to the enemy and hope for the best. It could be a good way to set them up for rapid ingress, maybe on turn 2 or turn 3 though. Could be pretty terrifying to have big units of them just drop onto the board and absolutely annihilate something with the opponent not being able to do so much about it. I feel like the battle line keyword could be more useful than some detachments that grant it out to random stuff. Feels like you could have 1 or 2 main damage dealers of 10-man squads, and then have a bunch of 5s for some punchy unit trading and wrecking some things that are tougher than them. Before we move on to the stratagems for the detachment though, I'll just give a proper shout out to Toy Snowman, the video sponsor. They're a gaming store based in Montreal in Canada, active since 2019. They have a huge array of collectibles and were quite into the Joy Toy 40k figures, and over the past year or so have been gradually getting more and more into 40k selling, having 15% off Games Workshop's prices as a good value discount retailer. Here's some pictures of their store, as mentioned based in Montreal. The 15% discount generally tends to be at the upper end of what Games Workshop allow people to sell for over in North America. The web store's pretty easy to search, and if you want any Warhammer things they don't happen to have in stock, you can email their sales email address and they can back order it in for you. They do the other things that you'd expect for discount retailers too, having free shipping at over $150 Canadian and also a loyalty reward program. In any case, they'll certainly be aiming to get in good stock of the new Votann releases or the new plastic kits in the Codex, so feel free to check them out at the weekend if you're seeking some space dwarves. There'll be links down in the video description if you'd like to give them a look, and a massive thank you to them for sponsoring this one. Let's get into the stratagems for the Dêlve assault shift though. There's a 1 command point 1 called Cyberstim Infusion. This one allows you to reroll wound rolls of 1 for berserks, or boosting it to all wound rolls if you spend 2 yield points as well. Just in general for stratagems in the book, I do feel like there's a bit of a common theme of it, where you basically get a pretty mid to bad stratagem for the regular command point cost, and then going up to be a genuinely good stratagem if you expend yield points. It does feel possible that it could be alright to just stay in the hostile acquisition for a bunch of different attachments and use the yield points just to plug into more powerful abilities. It might vary a bit depending on opponent or detachment. In any case, reroll 1s to wounds just isn't really all that great for 1 command point. I guess it does affect a fighter unit, and if every bit of damage matters, then it could be good enough. Certainly pretty punchy on the boosted version of it though. If you spend the yield points, then that feels quite nice. For 1 command point, there's Unstoppable Force. This one gives you pile in and consolidate 6 inches. That can be for any Leagues of Votann unit. That's handy enough for manipulation in the fight phase. Potentially you can get more models into the enemy units to be able to hit them harder, or potentially consolidate into either the next enemy unit or back to an objective or something if you're confident that you're wiping out your foe. For 1 command point, there's Augmented Assault. This one gives you advance and charge for Chthonian Berserks. I feel like that's maybe a standout one here, given that they're really quite punchy, but also not the fastest moving in the world. Means that they should have a pretty serious threat range when jumping out of a Sagittor or Land Fortress or something. Again, you can boost the stratagem by expending yield points. If you spend 1 of them, then you get a boosted 1-inch movement, or if you spend 2, then you get a boosted 2-inch movement. Feels like the yield point ones are maybe a bit of a luxury that you might not necessarily need to spend there. I feel like the advance and charge is perfectly good value for 1 CP. The option to go further isn't the worst though, I suppose. For 1 command point, we've got Tectonic Fracture. This one's for the new Chthonian artillery. After they've hit a unit, the unit they've hit is -2 to their movement characteristic, and if you spend 2 yield points, they're also -2 to charge. Just the -2 movement feels a little bit on the weak side for 1 command point. The boosted version could definitely be impactful enough to be worth it though, particularly if it stops a turn of melee for a slow but very fighty melee unit in the opponent's army. Again, maybe a bit peculiar though, both having to spend the command point and also the yield points for it, which maybe makes it feel just a tiny bit lower value. For 1 command point, there's Weaverwork Buttress. This one gives you a -1 to wound your infantry unit that gets attacked in the enemy shooting phase, and you can only use that if hostile acquisition is active. I feel like that's pretty reasonable that you might want to keep that active if you're going to be re-rolling charges with berserks. If you're spending lots of yield points, I feel like it might be active anyway as well. A -1 to wound is a nice enough stratagem. I guess it gives you a little bit of the fortified takeover without actually going into that. It feels like maybe the thing that it might be aimed for in this detachment is to make berserks very tough against small arms. They're toughness 6, and this one doesn't have any sort of cap on the sort of strength that it affects, so things like strength 5 or strength 4 will be wounding berserks on 6s. That feels that could be well worth using there. But for things that we're going to be wounding them on, say, a 3+ or something anyway, it's not really going to make them into a tough unit. They do have just the 1 wound now. Finally, for 1 command point, there's Hidden Access Ways. This one allows berserks, Hearthkin or Jaegers to return to strategic reserve, done at the end of the enemy fight phase if they're out of engagement range. This one's really a bad thing to have in just about any detachment. Again, it's not necessarily going to deliver berserks into melee, but it gives them a coin flip chance with hostile acquisition with the rerolls. It could well be the best thing that they could do to have a long shot charge on something important, or just give you units that can jump around and do secondary objectives late game. Definitely a handy one. Then for the enhancements of the Dêlve Assault Shift, we've got the Dêlve Worker Navigator. This one's printed at 25 points, and it's an interesting one that allows you to basically reinforce a Chthonian Berserks unit visible to the bearer in the reinforcement step of your movement phase. You basically heal one Berserk that has been slain from that unit, and then you can also spend any number of yield points. For every 2 yield points that you spend, you get to revive another model. This one does feel like at least a fairly powerful one, though it's also dependent on the Berserks being damaged but not destroyed, and as mentioned with 1 wound profiles, it feels like a lot of the time they're just going to get wiped out. Printed at 10 points, there's the Multi-Wave System Jammer, and this one allows you to revive a Chthonian unit as if it was 1 battle round later, so it means that you could have Deep Strike turn 1 for some Berserks if you'd like. It's maybe a bit of a mixed blessing though, given the odds on not to make a charge, around about a 50-50 chance with the hostile acquisition reroll. Could be worth a go if you've got at least a somewhat safe place to land them, I suppose. You wouldn't be able to combo it with rapid ingress due to the timing. I guess it gives you a few more options turn 1. Then printed at 20 points, we've got Quake Supervisor. This one gives the bearer a lone operative keyword when they're within 3 inches of an artillery unit, so those Cthonian Earthshakers, and then each time an artillery unit within 3 inches of the bearer shoots at a unit that the bearer can see, they get a +1 to hit. I guess having to target something that a unit that's within 3 inches of you can see sort of defeats the point of indirect fire a little bit. There's a very good chance they could have a +1 to hit from the army rules as well, say targeting on something on the objective. And if they're direct firing, then they'd have the heavy keyword. I guess maybe the way to make use of this could be have, say, a Memnyr on the home field objective with the enhancement. He could get some value from manipulating yield score, and then could maybe be standing out just in front of some terrain and directing fire from some artillery that's hidden behind terrain. So I guess you could basically have some firepower from a unit that was entirely hidden, and he could have additional value just from standing on the objective. Still feels like a bit of a curious one given how many ways there are to get a +1 to hit on those units though, and the way that this would restrict their targets as opposed to firing at, say, something that's out of line of sight and holding an objective. Finally, for 15 points, there's Pile Driver. You can opt to spend up to 2 yield points when the bearer fights. If they do, then you add that number to the damage of the bearer's melee weapons. Feels like this one's going to be most tempting on something that's, say, damage 1 or damage 2 and has a lot of attacks. It's just not going to be quite as high yield on something like an Ironkin Champion that only gets 3 attacks on the Seismic Hammer. Maybe it could be an argument for using their Darkstar Axe. Otherwise, I guess a card could have something like a damage 4 Mass Gauntlets. Maybe it could be okay as a points filler and decide whether or not to use it in a pinch. Maybe a little bit weird feeling to have an enhancement that's not going to be doing anything at all unless you're burning lots of yield points though. Overall, it definitely feels like an interesting detachment. As mentioned, it feels like the Chthonian Berserks are an interesting datasheet, having lots of damage against the toughest targets. Deep Strike could certainly give you another way to get them there alongside transport delivery for some others, and things like the reroll wound stratagem, the advance and charge stratagem, and the return to reserve stratagems all seem like good value. Certainly seems like it's got some interest, maybe could be a good way to represent some Cronus hegemony or very melee focused Votann on the board. Next up, we've got the sort of Hearthfyre and Scouty themed one in the Persecution Prospect. The idea behind this is that they're pinning down the enemy with volleys of fire and then maybe calling in heavier assets for the killing blow. Their core rule is called Guerrilla Adepts, and it triggers if when shooting a Votann unit focuses all of its firepower on one singular enemy unit. If it shoots all of its guns at that target and nothing else, then the enemy unit counts as being assailed. It doesn't work on monsters and vehicles, and the status doesn't do anything inherently, it just sets up the next one, and is useful for some stratagems and enhancements, which makes you better at damaging the unit in various ways. That effect will last until the start of your next shooting phase. If you double down though, and then also do the same with another unit, so another unit all focusing fire on one thing, then the enemy unit becomes pinned, getting a -2 to move and a -2 to charge rolls. As mentioned, that already is quite a meaningful debuff. If you have a slow-moving enemy melee unit, they might just be completely kept out of the fight by that. Could be very nice on some Terminators that, say, drops in and charge something, and that'll make them struggle to catch anything else. It does require a bit of setup though. It's going to be most useful if you've got multiple small units running around, maybe some split squads of Hearthkin Warriors or Jaegers, or some cheap transport vehicles like those new Kapricus. I feel like this rule, and in general the whole detachment, isn't going to be quite as good against monsters and vehicles though. Given that you can have entire armies that go very heavy on them, having a core rule and a whole bunch of rules that just don't work on them maybe isn't the best. Going through their stratagems, and for 1 command point there's Adaptable Avarice. For this one you can spend any number of yield points at the start of any phase if you have Fortified Takeover, effectively just burning them, and then immediately if you drop to 6 or less, you can immediately swap to Hostile Acquisition rather than having to wait until your next command phase. The stratagem targets a Votann character, so you need one surviving. I guess handy to always be able to flex back to the Hostile Takeover special rule if you feel like that's going to be more useful in any one turn. and it means that you could choose to do it at, say, the start of the shooting phase or the start of the charge phase. It does mean that if you did that though, then when you go into the enemy's next turn, you'd be losing out on the -1 to wounds. For 1 command point, there's Frontier Momentum. This one allows you to automatically advance a Hearthfyre unit 6 inches. Generally handy enough to have those, though the majority of their weapons aren't assault keyword weapons. I guess you'd be able to run some Hearthfyre Jaegers rather fast and still fire off a whole bunch of shotgun shots. I guess perhaps that's one to use if you absolutely need a really long advance to just tow onto an objective or something. For 1 command point, there's Exposed Floors. A Hearthfyre unit is able to reroll wound rolls against assailed units, so quite nice for those mid-strength autocannons firing there. And if you spend 2 yield points, then it can be used against any units, so no need to set up the enemy unit as assailed first. Reroll wound rolls is a pretty nice buff, though the Hearthfyre units maybe don't tend to be the absolute pinnacle of damage dealers. It's definitely not an unhelpful one though, and feels like Hearthfyre units you're going to have around in this detachment. For 1 command point, there's one called Ranger Tactics. This allows you to reroll hits against assailed units for any Votann unit in the shooting phase, and again better for Hearthfyre. If a Hearthfyre unit uses this, then they don't have to fire at assailed targets, they can just reroll hit rolls against anything. Maybe not too bad with a Votann ballistic skill of 4, and if you weren't getting the +1 to hit from anything, then you'd still be hitting pretty accurately. Otherwise though, if you can set up the unit as assailed, it's really powerful for things like Hecaton Land Fortresses or Brockhere Thunderkin with their really punchy guns. If you didn't have the +1 to hit active, then that could effectively be +50% damage, really good for 1 CP. For 1 command point, there's Claimstaker Reflex. This one's a reactive move for a non-vehicle or non-artillery unit, triggered when an enemy unit ends a move within 9 inches of you. Your unit gets to make a d6 inch normal move, and that move is boosted to a 6 inches if you spend an additional 2 yield points. You can't use the move to embark in a transport. Reactive moves in 40k generally tend to be good news, particularly ones that you can automatically get 6 inches even if you're spending points for them. It basically means that an important unit could basically back 6 inches away from a charge and make it far less likely to happen. Or if the enemy is moving up and triggers that, then it means that you could hide behind a ruin before the enemy shooting phase happens. That one does feel like a really good advantage and an asset to the detachment. Finally, for 1 command point, there's Dispersed Formation. Infantry or mounted units get stealth and the benefit of cover against ranged attacks this phase. A pretty handy reactive defensive one there. -1 to hit and effectively a +1 to save if you didn't have cover already are both good buffs. Handy enough for basically any of the leagues of Votann to make them a bit tougher to take down. Feels like Ironkin Hearthguard will get on with that quite well. Finally, for the Persecution prospect, we've got the Enhancements. For 25 points, there's Eye for Weakness. This one gives the bearer's unit a +1 to wound against assailed units. Potentially really quite a good damage buff, though it does require other units to essentially mark targets for them and set that up. It does seem that that could be really nasty for something like a Brockhere Ironmaster with some Thunderkin though, or perhaps a Memnyr with some Ironkin Steeljacks with their Vulcanite. And particularly in combo with that 1 command point 1 to reroll all hit rolls, you could be rerolling all hits and then +1 to wound against your assailed targets. As with assailed things though, you wouldn't be able to trigger it against monsters and vehicles though, as they can't be assailed, so it does have its limitations, and the +1 to wound might have been best against the tough stuff. For 10 points, there's Writ of Acquisition. In the shooting phase, after the bearer's unit is shot, gain 1 yield point per assailed unit hit by their shooting, up to a maximum of 3. Feels like that to be kind of hard to set up maximally, but even if you manage to trigger it once per shooting phase, not the worst. Feels like it could be alright as a points filler for 10 points, doesn't really feel like it's going to be the most meaningful. For 10 points, there's Surgical Saboteur. This one allows you to do a bit against monsters and vehicles and make them pinned but not assailed. Again triggered if you fire against the unit, so there'll be -2 to move and -2 to charge. Could be nice for a slow moving melee monster in particular. Doesn't feel like the worst counterpoint to the detachment rule to have this about, if the majority of the army isn't going to be so great against monsters and vehicles. There's no Titanic restriction as well, so it does mean that you could push it on knights and things. Finally, there's Nomad Strategist. This one's printed at 20 points. Once per battle at the end of the enemy fight phase, you can return 1 Hearthfyre unit to strategic reserve, and then either spends an extra 2 yield points for another Hearthfyre unit, or 4 for a total of 3. And interestingly enough, for this one, you are allowed to nominate units in engagement range, provided the enemy units that you're in range of are assailed. Return to reserves is a pretty powerful option, handy enough to have for the Hearthfyre Pioneers, and presuming you're having a fair few Hearthfyre squads running around in this one, there's a pretty reasonable chance that could be worth it if you can keep it safe somewhere. Overall, I'd certainly say that this one feels like another interesting detachment. Maybe feels like the core rule isn't the single strongest in the world, requiring multiple units to potentially be firing at targets that are suboptimal to trigger a slowing effect. It is a good debuff, but only going to be relevant against certain enemies all that much. Some of the stratagems are quite nice though. Hearthfyre rerolling all wounds is quite nice. Rerolling all hits for potentially any unit against assailed targets is nice too. The reactive move is a good one, and return to reserves is a handy bonus. It does feel like the detachment's more weak to monsters and vehicles compared with the majority of them though. Just feels a little inflexible that a lot of the best stuff is linked to assailed units, and vehicles and monsters can't be assailed. Next up, we've got the transport-focused detachment, and that's the Brandfast Oathband. The core rule for this one basically has Leagues of Votann transport vehicles act as mobile command centres and give you sustained hits to infantry units that are wholly within 6 inches when they're attacking in the shooting phase. It basically means that you could have a pretty big scary gun line with some transport vehicles around, lots of extra damage for units that already shoot quite hard. In particular, this feels excellent for the Brockier Thunderkin. Their damage profiles are just looking massively scary, and the Thunderkin might really enjoy that for their conversion beamers as well, being able to get some sustained hits on a 4+ there, in addition to the lethal hits that their core rule now gives them. Both the Sagitaurs and the Land Fortresses can also shoot really quite hard for the cost despite being transport vehicles. It just feels between all this it's quite good news for an overall gun line. For stratagems, for 1 command point, there's secure positions. This one allows you to disembark 6 inches from a transport at the end of any phase, so perhaps a surprisingly flexible one there. You do have to have hostile acquisition active to be able to use this though. Being at the end of any phase does give you a fair few interesting options that you wouldn't normally be able to do. You could perhaps drop an enemy unit in the enemy fight phase, where basically you could have a transport vehicle hidden, and then they jump out 6 inches after the opponent's turn is done, and then basically your unit has jumped out ready to claim an objective where your opponent had no chance to kill them before. That does seem weirdly powerful and hard to interact with, to be honest. Otherwise, you could again do similar in the command phase or the end of the enemy fight phase to basically have a +3 inches threat range for a melee unit. Essentially, Chthonian Berserks could get out 6 inches rather than 3 before they move and charge, or you could use to get it out in the enemy turn sometime to set up for either heroic intervention or overwatch. This one definitely feels like it's got a lot of power to it though, and if you could keep a transport alive within 6 inches or an objective that the opponent can't claim too well, you can basically guarantee that you've got a unit that can claim it if you can spend 1 command point. For 1 CP, there's Bastion running. This one allows a Hecaton Land Fortress to crush through terrain features with normal or advanced moves. Always handy enough for making sure that big chunky vehicles aren't too limited by terrain, and could allow both it and any transport contents getting out to get good lines of sight. For 1 command point, there's Illuminated Priority. You nominate 1 unit hit by a vehicle shooting attacks, and then your infantry units get to reroll hit rolls of 1 against that target. I feel like for 1 command point, that's a pretty weakish buff. Rerolling hit rolls of 1 is basically a +16% damage boost, not really the most mighty in the world. I guess it could potentially theoretically affect several units worth of infantry. Maybe if you had lots of Thunderkin focusing fire on 1 super big target. Maybe it doesn't help that a fair few units get that on their datasheet as well. Ironkin Hearthguard and Hearthkin Warriors might both have that. For 1 command point, there's Inexorable Efficiency. This one allows you to fall back and still shoot for any unit. Again, that's nice enough to have, particularly for the Leagues of Votann. If you've got lots of vehicles running around, it's still going to be helpful for things like Land Fortresses. They don't have to choose between remaining in melee with something dangerous and just simply not shooting this turn. And also good for other valuable units like maybe the Ironkin Steeljacks or the Thunderkin. If the opponent's been able to engage them with chaff, then this is insurance against them getting locked up and not being able to fire. For 1 command point, there's Opportunist Escalation. This one allows one of your non-Land Fortress vehicles that was just shot to normal move d6 inches somewhere. And again, you must have hostile acquisition active to be able to use this one. I guess in theory, if you had a Sagitaur or a Kapricus vehicle and it was just poking around terrain or something, you could use this to hide it and keep it safe, or maybe move it away from an enemy charge or move it onto an objective. I feel like this one's just maybe going to be a tiny bit low yield given that the units it's going to affect are going to be kind of cheap. Feels like if it could affect Land Fortresses, it'd be far more meaningful. If you do have some of those running around though, I'm sure there'll be some opportunistic opportunities to use it. Finally, for 2 command points, there's one called Vengeance Flare. This one triggers when an infantry unit within 6 inches of your vehicle was just shot, and then basically the vehicle gets to return fire against that same unit, the one that shot the infantry. If you want to use this on a Hecaton Land Fortress, you additionally have to spend 2 yield points. Again, similarly to the Escalation one, it just feels like it's going to be a bit mid on cheapish vehicles like the Kapricus and Sagitaur. Just feels like it's going to be so much more important on a Land Fortress, even if you are paying a couple more yield points for it. Volleys from a Land Fortress have a pretty reasonable chance of just wiping out an enemy unit or doing some really meaningful damage to them. Just feels like that's more likely to be able to justify 2 command point spend, as opposed to a single Hylas beam or something. Finally, for the enhancements, there's one called Tactical Alchemy for 10 points printed. This one's for a car model, and you get to use it when you're in range of an objective marker outside of your deployment zone that you control in your command phase. and it basically gives you the option to spend 1 yield point. If he does, then you gain a command point on a 4+. It is quite cheap, but also really quite a lot of setup, and requiring one specific character. You would need to keep him alive on that mid-board objective as well, given that it triggers in your command phase, so the opponent would have a turn to gun him down. Just feels a little bit unlikely to be overall worth it. Maybe could be alright if you're transporting some Ironkin Hearthfyre with plasma rifles and want some lethal hits in the unit, though it just feels a little bit unlikely to be top priority to me. For 30 points, there's one called the Prioritised Cyber Implant. This one's a huge damage buff, with ranged weapons in the bearer's unit getting sustained hits too after disembarking from a transport, or even if they haven't, you can expend 2 yield points to basically get the same damage buff. As it goes, that does seem like a very good damage boost. Pretty great for Thunderkin or maybe Ironkin Steeljacks. Could be alright for Hearthguard as well. In particular though, it looks like it's just ridiculously murderous damage for the Conversion Beam Thunderkin. If they can get an enemy unit within optimal range, those sustained hits go off on a 4+. So for every 4+ that they roll, they basically get 1 lethal hits and 2 sustained hits. It seems pretty murderous, and he can fit 6 of them with a Brockhir Iron Master or then 1 Land Fortress now. For 15 points, there's Precursive Judgment. This one's for a car, and it allows his units to fire Overwatch for free, and they'll hit on a 5+ as well, provided that they're near a transport vehicle. If they're within range of the transport vehicle, that also means they're getting the sustained hits 1 as well, so basically hitting on 5s and 6s get 2 hits. Basically it equates to a fairly normal shooting phase for a unit, but in Overwatch and for free. And because it's a car in a unit as well, they'd also get lethal hits as well. Between all that, it's kind of surprisingly punchy. Maybe at least seems somewhat interesting on, say, some Ironkin Hearthguard with the plasma guns. Still not sure whether or not it'd be enough to encourage that kind of unit though, at least in comparison with very heavy direct damage dealers like the Thunderkin. Finally, for 5 points, there's Signature Restoration. This one is a direct buff to the Iron Master's healing abilities, basically meaning that he repairs vehicles for 1 extra wound compared with normal. That would usually mean he's healing 4 wounds to a Land Fortress, which is pretty excellent value to have in support there. Feels like Land Fortresses will be a good focus for this detachment, and at just 5 points that seems well worth it if you're having one support them. Overall, again, I'd say there's easily enough to be interesting here. It's one of the few detachments with a flat damage buff, and quite a useful one that can affect some meaningful units, particularly the Brockhir Thunderkin seem pretty great with that. Otherwise, the 6-inch Disembark could be really interesting for objective scoring shenanigans. Statutours or the Kapricus transports could be good for that. Smashing through terrain is nice support for the Land Fortress. Fallback and shoot is handy to have for the entire Votann army, and some of the other stratagems are pretty good opportunistically. Seems like the Cyber Implant could be a really interesting option for a Thunderkin unit as well, amping up the detachment rule to the next level. Next up, we've got some experimental Science Votann in the Hearthfyre arsenal. This one's themed around the Brockhir Engineers, the Ironkin, and Votann science in general. The core rule for this one is called Optimal Application. You gain 1 yield point at the end of your command phase for each objective marker outside of your deployment zone that either has an Iron Master or a Memnyr within range of it, up to a max of 2 yield points. Basically get those characters to the mid board and you have some more yield points to throw around, and then you have a different way of spending yield points if you'd like to. Whenever a Brockhir, Steeljacks or Arkanyst Evaluator unit shoots, you can reroll hit rolls of 1 if you expend 1 yield point. It does help some genuinely good shooting units, but I feel like even if the army rule was overall reroll 1s to hit for everything, it'd be alright but not standout. Being locked to certain units and having to expend resources every time that you want to use it does make it a little bit more mid. For stratagems, for 2 command points, there's Unwavering Accuracy. Thunderkin gets to ignore modifiers to ballistic skill, the hit roll, the wound roll, and AP. It's definitely an interesting stratagem and affects a scary damage dealer unit, but at the same time, I feel like if you're only getting advantage of one of those, it's going to be kind of mid. It'd be good value if it was 1 CP, but unless you're ignoring multiple things for the 2 command points, just seems unlikely to have standout value. Maybe it could be alright if you've got Uthal the Destined somewhere nearby to discount the cost of it. For 1 command point, there's First Concern. After a Brockhir, Steeljacks or Arkanyst unit is shot, it can make a normal move. They can only use this one if the unit remains stationary in the previous movement phase. I feel like the restriction of this one makes it significantly less good. It's just going to be kind of situational whether or not that unit can afford to remain stationary in the movement phase. If they've unexpectedly survived out in the open and have some good targets to fire at, then all well and good. I guess particularly if they don't need to move towards objective markers. If the stars align, I guess it means that you could potentially shoot down an enemy unit and then use this to retreat out of line of sight so that the opponent can't shoot them in their next turn. Maybe feels like one to look out for opportunistically. Could be handy for some shenanigans with the Arkanyst Evaluators and their sort of pseudo-lone operative style things, but maybe doesn't feel like one that you'd usually guarantee planning around. For 1 command point, there's Delayed Fire Rounds. After again a Brockhir, Steeljacks or Arkanyst unit is shot, one unit that's hit by them that isn't a monster or vehicle is chosen. Until the start of your next shooting phase, whenever that unit makes a normal fallback or advanced move, you roll 1d6 per model in the enemy unit, and for each one that you roll, that enemy unit suffers a mortal wound. It does mean that that one's not going to be super high yield. It's going to be around about 3 or 4 wounds against a 20 strong unit that hadn't taken any casualties from that shooting, and those models are probably going to be horde style ones. Can be interesting to get mortal wounds out of sequence, but just feels like that one's going to be so low yield that it's not really worth bothering with. For 1 command point, there's Wall of Steel. This one's an Ironkin Steeljacks one that gives them some punchy mortal wound impact hits on the charge. You roll 1d6 per model in your unit, and for each 4+, the enemy takes a mortal wound to a max of 6, and you can spend 2 yield points to roll 2 additional dice if you'd like to. I guess averaging 1 extra mortal wound for 2 points expended. Maybe the interesting one about this one is there's no requirement for the Steeljack models to be in engagement range, so you will be able to roll for the entirety of the unit, even if you just manage to touch the enemy. It feels like for 1 command point that could be reasonable enough value, presuming it wasn't just a target that the Steeljacks are going to obliterate in melee anyway. Overall feels like it could be a draw to use in the melee ones in this detachment. For 1 command point, there's Preventative Purge. You use this one after an enemy unit falls back from a Thunderkin or Ironkin Steeljack unit, and then you get to shoot the enemy unit that just fell back, subtracting 1 from the hit roll. Getting an out-of-sequence shooting attack with either of those could be genuinely very easily worth 1 command point. It's just the setup that's kind of weird. In general, the units you actually care about firing with would be the Vulcanite ones and the Brockier Thunderkin, but then if they're in melee, then it's generally a bad situation for them. If you've charged some enemy units with them, the enemy units could probably just stay in melee as they're locking them up and preventing them from firing, and this detachment doesn't give them any way to fall back and shoot. Just feels like it doubles the incentive for the opponents to stay in melee and keep locking them up, even if they can't kill them. So it kind of feels like its use would be limited to, say, bullying very light enemy units that can't take a few plasma knife attacks from the Steeljacks, or if the opponent desperately needs to shoot them with other things that actually destroy the unit, even if they could stop their firepower. Overall just feels like a generally powerful stratagem that very rarely going to have any sort of chance to use it. Finally, for 1 command point, there's Cogitated Need. This one gives the Ironkin Steeljacks an unusual out-of-sequence move, basically allowing them to move at the end of the enemy movement phase towards the closest possible objective, and I guess potentially disrupt what your opponent's units can see them, or pile some more OC onto a point. That definitely feels like an interesting one, and one that you could think about setting up. Maybe feels like it could be most reliable to use for some of the ranged ones near your home objective, if you could put the unit in such a way that going directly towards the home objective would allow them to hide out of line of sight. You could potentially have the Vulcanite ones move out of terrain, shoot the enemy very hard, and then just hide back behind that terrain. So you might have some scary Vulcanite firepower that the opponent couldn't really do too much about. That would depend on having a terrain feature in a very specific place though. Otherwise feels like it maybe could be useful in the midboard. A lot of the time though, if they have to move directly towards an objective and finish as close as possible, then it might mean that the unit gets exposed. And it's not like they have crazy amounts of OC either, so might not necessarily swing an objective. Finally, for enhancements for the Hearthfyre arsenal, there's a Fast Rider node for 20 points. Basically all the enhancements in this detachment either for Brockier Ironmasters or Memnyr Strategists, and this one can be taken by either. This one just gives you a plain and simple, this model's unit gets Deep Strike, really quite a fun one, and it means that you could have some Thunderkin just teleport onto the board and light up the enemy with heavy firepower. No need for any transports or anything to get them there. That one does feel like really quite a fun one. Seems like a solid draw to the detachment. Thunderkin have heavy firepower, and this basically near guarantees that they're going to get it where it needs to go. For 15 points, there's Calculated Tenacity. This one's again for an Ironmaster or a Memnyr. It gives you +1 OC to models in the bearer's unit. Maybe it could be alright for a Memnyr with durable Steeljacks, having OC 2 each. Maybe it could be a side bonus for ones that are holding a home field objective with a Memnyr farming up the yield tokens. Maybe not awful for some melee ones put into the mid-board and using that tank shock style stratagem. At 15 points though, it does feel a bit on the mid-side. For 10 points, there's the Mantle of Elders. This one's for a Memnyr Strategist only, and it basically allows you to regenerate yield points on a 2+ when you spend them on his units to use the detachment rule. So basically you get the reroll ones to hit, you roll a dice, and on a 2+ you refund that yield token. Given that that's really quite cheap, it seems nice enough for some ranged Steeljacks, essentially near enough free reroll ones to hit for the vast majority of the game. It's not nothing and does help their firepower, though I wouldn't say it's huge either. Finally, for 5 points, there's Graviton Vault. This one's for the Ironmaster model only. It basically gives the Ironmaster's own weapons a debuff. Once you've hit a monster or vehicle, then that monster or vehicle is -1 to hit until the start of your next turn. Maybe okay as a points filler, and for 5 points it is very cheap. I guess it could be nice enough if you do wind up shooting against something like a big Titanic monster or knight or something and don't wind up killing it. For 5 points, it's not bad value. Overall, I feel like this detachment just feels a bit on the frustrating side to me. Most of the units it buffs are really quite interesting ones that doesn't really do all that much direct to help them. Reroll ones to hit isn't nothing, but it's not loads. Aside from maybe the tank shock style one, there's just literally no stratagems that just seem reliably useful turn on turn. They're all situational or opponent dependent, or I guess maybe dependent on the terrain that you have in terms of cogitated need, firing and fading, some Vulcanite Steeljacks. It feels like the deep strike enhancement is a fairly good positive. The detachment rule does add a bit, but I just can't help but feel that overall you're probably going to have more value out of the other detachments. If you do happen to have a bunch of transport vehicles around, you could have sustained hits one for your Thunderkin and Ironkin just using the transport detachment, and the Needgaârd Oathband has some good damage buffs as well. It just feels like this one doesn't do quite enough for focusing on quite a narrow subset of the Codex, even if the units are fun ones. Speaking of which though, finally we've got the Needgaârd Oathband. This one's basically the redone version of the Oathband from the Index. It was quite a judgment token focused detachment, so all the mechanics for that have been swapped out for the yield point ones. It feels like it's aiming to be the most conventional Leagues of Votann detachment, with things that support the vast majority of units in the Codex and some pretty helpful damage and defensive style buffs. The core rule for this one maybe isn't super standout though. It's martial leverage, and basically each time an enemy unit gets destroyed, you gain 1 yield point. I guess over the course of the game gradually building up, so you get fortified takeover faster, though probably more importantly having more resources that you can put into the boosted versions of some stratagems in the detachment. It does feel like the strength of the detachment is in the stratagems rather than this though. In general for the Needgaârd Oathband, really quite a lot of the stratagems are similar to the previous Oathband. Lots of returning ones that generally tended to be quite powerful, though in general the difference is that you don't have to target judgment token units with them, instead you have to expend yield points to get the boosted versions. For 1 command point, there's one called Honour the Hold. This one gives you an extra pip of AP in the fight phase, and if you spend a big 3 yield points, you get plus 2 AP instead. Just the 1 CP for 1 AP is a decent buff though. Chthonian Berserks hitting at AP 3 rather than AP minus 2 is far more scary. It works well enough for literally anything else that's Leagues of Votann and Melee though. For 1 CP, Ancestral Sentence returns. This one again still gives you the sustained hits 1 for a shooting attack, and if you spend 3 yield points on top of that, then you get Sustained Hits 2 instead. Sustained Hits 2 is a really quite punchy big damage buff. Again, looking really nice on the Brockhear Thunderkin, I guess in either version, but particularly with their conversion beams. With really big 3 yield point cost though, you are going to have to pick and choose which of the boosted stratagems that you access. Maybe to make that decision yet harder, there's one called Void Hardened. This one's basically the new version of Void Armor, and again it basically worsens enemy AP against the units by -1, though now you can only use it in Fortified Takeover, so meaning that you will need to have 7 yield points in your previous command phase. Kind of a shame to just have the same stratagem but directly a bit worse. You're not going to be able to use this in the early game so much, and as per the balance data slate it's still only going to affect the attacks of 1 unit. Then for 1 command point there's Ordered Retreat. This one's fallback, shoot and charge. Generally very handy to have, and really nice for Leagues of Votann with some powerful shooting units that don't want to get locked up and made useless. Hard to go too far wrong with that. For 2 command points there's Reactive Reprisal. This one makes a return but again is locked to only being able to be used if you have Fortified Takeover active. This one really feels like a detachment where you're going to probably want to build towards that and probably have a Memnyr on the home field objective to help. This one's similar to how it was before. One of your units that was shot by the enemy in their shooting phase gets to shoot back at that same enemy unit that shot it. It is a big 2 command points, though really quite powerful with something like a Hecaton Land Fortress, a target where the opponent's quite likely to deal some damage but not outright kill it, and then it can hit back very very hard indeed. Then finally for 1 command point there's Hunter's Mark. This one allows you to reroll hits and wounds of 1 in the shooting phase for this unit. Plenty of Leagues of Votann units can access that in one way or another elsewhere, but if they can't then it's really quite a powerful damage buff, essentially giving you plus 36% damage. Could be nice on a land fortress that doesn't have the scanner option, or any big shooting unit without rerolls. Again, maybe the Brockhear Thunderkin. This one basically replaces the stratagem that gave units judgment tokens. In general, compared with the other detachments, it still feels like this one's got bigger and scarier stratagems, lots of things that are just really easy to get value out of, and ones that you could happily use turn after turn. Then for enhancements, first up we've got Ancestral Crest. This one's printed at 15 points, and this one allows you to spend a yield point as a command point reroll once per turn, so it could allow you to reroll a failed save or a failed wound roll or something. Maybe it could be nice enough for rerolling a failed save on a Hearthguard, or a failed charge roll could be high value. It does feel a bit weak given that you need to spend resources to make it happen though, and perhaps particularly in this detachment where you're probably wanting to save up those yield points for those boosted stratagems, and also for remaining in Fortified Takeover to allow access to 2 more. For 30 points there's one called Oathband Speculator. This one gives you reroll wound rolls of 1 for the bearer's unit, a small damage boost that definitely doesn't hurt to have, though it gives you the option to spend 3 yield points to make the bearer's unit +1 to wound when they either shoot or fight. Kind of interesting with that one, as it gives you basically a different stratagem thing, but you pay the cost with yield points, not with command points. Again, that's to be competing with the other ones, but a +1 to wound is a pretty powerful damage buff. It does seem like at least a fairly interesting one. For 10 points there's Dead Reckoning. If the bearer is on the battlefield, then at the end of the turn and he spent no yield points, you can gain 1 yield point. I guess given that it says the end of the turn and not the end of your turn, that means it's a trigger in the enemy turn. I guess could accelerate you being able to generate enough for Fortified Takeover before he gets to spending them in earnest. Feels like for 10 points that could be well worth it in this detachment, potentially on something safe like a Memnyr that's camping the home field and generating yield points in his own way. Finally, for a very cheap one, there's Iron Ambassador for just 5 points. This one's for a Leagues of Votann model with an Autok Combi Bolter, so I guess that's either the Carl or the Ironhead Champion. This one allows you to spend 3 yield points, and if they do until the end of the phase, you add that many damage to the bearer's ranged weapons, so potentially all the way up to a damage 4 combi bolter if you wanted it. 1 yield point could have a punchy bolter with strength 4, AP 0 and damage 2 I suppose. Feels like a kind of fun upgrade. I just can't help but think again in this detachment you're probably best off saving those yield points for the things that matter more. Overall, between all this, it's still looking like a good detachment. It's maybe not going to have great feels when compared with the index, given that it does feel like more things are more restrictive and harder to access. Having 2 of the stratagems locked to Fortified Takeover isn't amazing, as you wouldn't be able to use them early on, and 2 of them have some pretty hefty yield point costs. It does feel like a whole bunch of the stuff is really quite directly helpful here though, and maybe more so than some of the other detachments, plus has the bonus of being really quite flexible and usable on the entire Leagues of Votann roster, as opposed to locked to certain keywords. I still overall expect this one to be a very good one. In any case, those are the 5 detachments. I feel like Games Workshop have done at least fairly well with them here. I guess my instincts are still probably that the Needgaârd one might be the single most powerful. It boosts damage and defense in quite a straightforward way, though I feel like most of the rest have some genuinely great selling points. The Persecution one can make some pretty nasty firepower happen. Rerolling all hit rolls is nice. Reactive moves, pinning units, and returning things to reserve certainly don't hurt either. The Brandfast Transport one also feels pretty nice as well. Leagues of Votann have 3 out of their 4 vehicles being transports. They're fairly good damage dealers in their own right, and that one does have some interesting options. Sustained hits 1 on nearby infantry is genuinely nice for Thunderkin. Feels like they've got a couple of nice enhancements as well. The Chthonian Berserks one seems fun. Getting them advance and charge and deep striking everywhere certainly feels like it could be interesting ways to get them to combat, and they do have command points to reroll wound rolls when they're there. I do kind of wonder whether it's going to be enough to build around that one datasheet though, particularly as they're kind of slow when they're on the board and not using stratagems and really quite fragile. Finally, the Hearthfyre one just feels a bit on the underwhelming side to me. Stratagems that do interesting things, but do have annoying limitations at the same time. And the detachment rule gives you a very small damage buff, but only for the constant sacrificing of yield points. I just can't help but think it's going to be kind of directly inferior to the Needgaârd Oathband or maybe the transport detachment, even if the units that it supports do seem like very interesting ones. In any case, it will be interesting to see what people choose to put on the table when it comes to strong lists and tournaments and things. I feel like they have done enough to make most of these really quite interesting in their own way. It would be cool if there's multiple detachments that wind up being strong enough to compete well. Moving on to the other half of the Codex though, and let's talk about the Leagues of Votann datasheets. They gained quite a clutch with their new wave of model kits, 21 datasheets in total, listed here. For their options, they've got the Carl Ironhead Champion, Grimnir, Brockhair Ironmaster, Memnyr Strategist and Arkanyst Evaluator, 2 named characters in Oathband the Destined and Buri Aegnirssen, and then for squads they've got the Hearthkin Warriors, Ironhair Hearthguard, Ironkin Pioneers, Chthonian Berserks, Brockhair Thunderkin, Ironkin Steeljacks, the Ironkin Jaegers and the Cthonian Earthshaker Artillery. Finally they've got 4 vehicle datasheets now, the Sagittor and the Land Fortress as before, joined by the 2 Kapricus datasheets, the Carrier as a transport and the Defender as a light gun platform. The Steeljacks also have a split datasheet as well, one for their ranged loadout and one for their melee. It does feel quite nice to see their roster increase a fair bit. They didn't really have all that many different battlefield roles covered before. Still feels like there's other things that are missing. It'd be cool to get that jump pack unit that seems kind of inevitable given that we've seen a jump pack for them, and certainly feels like a big mech suit style thing would fit in well with their themes. Before jumping into the datasheets, I'll just mention points briefly. There are points costs printed in the books, though they don't tend to be the final ones. Generally Games Workshop revise them to a greater or lesser extent. For example, we had the Combat Engineers from the Astra Militarum Codex earlier in 2025. They were printed at 35 points, and their final cost was double that at 70. Games Workshop will issue their new digital points costs sometime within the next couple of weeks. Sometimes they share them to content creators over the weekend, and if they do, I'll aim to talk through them when they drop. The book points can still give us an idea as to what they were thinking though, particularly if they've nerfed a unit and then reduced the points cost in the book. It shows they were thinking about putting down the points cost to reflect their newer worse value, or the other way around. For their units, I thought we could talk through all the new datasheets first, and then go through the rest in turn, from the squads to the vehicles, then the characters. First up, we've got the Ironkin Steeljacks. These are an Ironkin fighting unit, which is kind of fun. So robot space dwarves, armed with big chunky and unusually mighty bodies. Weirdly enough, standing tall, so twice the height of a kin. Maybe feels a little bit unusual they didn't keep a slightly more dwarf-like aesthetic for them. It seems their pricing is, as I predicted, around about £37 or $60, and I think they're pretty fun. People didn't really rate them as maybe super standout out of the new model reveals. I feel like they perhaps lean into the area that tends to get criticised for the Leagues of Votann, maybe just looking a little bit generic sci-fi, even if I do quite like the feel of them as robot space dwarf soldiers. The Ironkin Steeljacks get two different datasheets, a ranged one with the heavy vulcanite disintegrators, and then a melee loadout. The ranged version is printed at a points cost of 80 points for 3 or 160 for 6. That might change, of course. And they've got a pretty big and chunky defensive stat line. They move 5 inches and then have 3 wounds at toughness 6 with a 2+ save. So small arms aren't going to be doing too much to them. You're going to need some special weapons or heavy weapons to take them down. Otherwise, they're an infantry datasheet with leadership 7 and OC 1. I was interested to find out the profile of those big guns. The heavy vulcanite disintegrator seems like they have 6 attacks at 24-inch range, hitting on a 4+ at strength 6, AP 1 and damage 1, and with devastating wounds as with other vulcanite weapons. It means that these guys are going to be absolutely obliterating hordes with that, wounding toughness 3 models on a 2+ and with a bit of AP as well. And for most other things, they're not going to be standout damage output, but will be able to do at least some damage to literally everything they shoot at. They will get some 6s and some mortal wounds punched through. In melee, they have a little bit of threat as well. They get plasma knives with 2 attacks at strength 6, AP 2 and damage 1. They hit on a 3+, and it does mean they should be able to dispatch a few light infantry if they get engaged by them. The Thane in the unit can replace their disintegrator with a plasma sword and pistol, the same profile as the melee version, but it seems just a bit questionable to do that if you're going to have a more dedicated ranged unit. For their special rules, the Thane gets a Primarch crest as a bit of war gear. This one allows critical wounds against enemies within range of an objective marker to get the precision ability. So that means if they have a big volley of shots, any 6s to wound will be targeted at characters, and that's doubly impactful given that those 6s will be devastating wounds. It means that these guys are actually going to be kind of unlikely good snipers. With a good volley, they might well be able to just dispatch an enemy character or leader. So it's going to be very scattergun and random, depending on whether or not they roll a batch of 6s or none. Otherwise, their second special rule is Purge Response. This allows you to overwatch on a 5+ with a unit, going up to a 4+ while they have the Fortified Takeover rule. Potentially, if you have a full-on unit of 6 of them, then that could be pretty well worth it. With 36 shots, that means that you're hitting with 12 of their profile. Against enemy lighter infantry advancing, that could be easily worth it, or pretty nice for stripping the last wound off something that was damaged maybe. It's a rule that also combos really well with having a Memnyr Strategist lead them, given that he can make them overwatch for free. Overall, they do feel like an interesting unit. If they do remain 160 points for 6 of them, then they're really not all that expensive. Their volume 5 certainly is going to have some big effects. I do just wonder whether or not they're going to be used too much. As still a fairly high investment unit though, if they're just not really that good against tough stuff. Whenever they have to shoot monsters and vehicles, it does feel like they're going to be underwhelming. For their melee counterpart datasheet, these guys are listed at a higher points cost. It's written at 100 points for 3 or 200 for 6, so quite significantly more expensive there. And for their weapons, they get an Autop pattern bolter with a pistol keyword, so 2 shots to 24-inch range there, and then all the models get to choose either between Plasma Sword or Concussion Gauntlet. The Plasma Swords get them 6 attacks, hitting on a 3 at strength 6, AP 2, damage 1, with sustained hits, potentially 30 hits on average out of a 6 model unit there, and the Concussion Gauntlets get them 3 attacks each. They only hit on a 4+ though, but have a boosted profile of strength 10, AP 2, damage 2, and lethal hits. I feel like if anything, maybe the Plasma Swords might be the way to go on them. The Gauntlet profile is certainly punchier, but you're only going to be getting around about a third of the hits from them. It just doesn't feel like a unit of 6 of them is going to be an enormous threat to big tough stuff. They also get the Primarch crest as well, and then they have Merciless Eradication. Enemy units that fall back from them have to test Desperate Escape, and a -1 to that test if they're battle shocked. it doesn't affect monsters and vehicles. As special rules go, I'm not sure I'm the biggest fan of that one. Kind of puts the power in the opponent's point of view. Often losing a third of the unit on average isn't the end of the world, and if it is, then they can just remain in melee and countercharge or something. If they did wind up being 200 points though, I'm just a little bit unconvinced as to how good they are for the stats. Feels to me like they'd have to be significantly less than that at first impressions. They are fairly tough, but they don't have an enormous damage output, and they're kind of slow as well at 5-inch move. They're not going to be making it into melee in a big hurry, not without a land fortress transport at least. Next up for the new models, we've got the Cthonian Earthshakers. These guys are the great big mole mining artillery style unit, burrowing a projectile into the ground to emerge amongst the enemy soldiers and blow up. The kit has a few fun details with some armor head swaps and things, plus the Ironkin assistant being able to load different sort of shells in different poses. Kind of a fun idea that harks back to the mole mining things of the squats of old, and seem to be priced similar to the Astra Militarum Field Ordnance batteries at £34 or $58. In game they do come in units of 2s as they're packaged. Their points are printed at 95 points, and for that you get a movement 4 base, so they won't be going anywhere particularly fast, with 6 wounds, with a toughness 6 and a 4+ save. It does mean that some incidental small arms shouldn't be able to destroy them too easily. For their wargear choice, they either get Breacher Ordnance or Tremor Shells. You do have to choose that pre-game and declare it on your army list. Also similar ones with different sort of ordnance types get to choose one or the other each turn, but not so for these. The Breacher one is the heavy hitting damage dealing one. It's got a slightly smaller range of 24 inches. It's got the blast, heavy and indirect fire keywords, and then you have d6+1 attacks, hitting on a 5+, at strength 10, AP 1 and damage 2. It's definitely going to be hitting a lot harder than the Tremor Shells, and gets a special rule called Geomantic Hunters. Twice per game you get to reroll wound rolls with that ordnance, but the 24-inch range is going to limit what targets they're going to be able to fire. If they're hiding in the home field, they're going to be able to hit things on mid-board objectives, and perhaps not all of them. Otherwise though, their secondary option are the Tremor Shells. They've got longer range at 36 inches, d6+4 attacks at strength 6, AP -1 and damage 1, and they trigger Battle Shock to the enemy at -1 to the test. The extra range is definitely a big advantage, and that's a profile that will be very good for destroying certain objective grabbers, things like say Chaos Cultists or maybe Orc Boys. It's not a very flexible one though, and unlike the Breacher Shells, it's just not going to do very much against tough stuff. Otherwise each base gets a pair of Autop Bolt Pistols for a little bit of close defense if they're engaged, and I guess given they're Chthonians, their melee is better than you might expect. 4 attacks hitting on a 3 at strength 5, AP 2 and damage 1. With heavy and hitting on a 5+, that normally means they'll be hitting on a 5 against things that they can't see. There's a good chance they might get boosted by the army rule, I suppose, either shooting things on objectives or being within range of the home field objective once you get to fortified takeover. There is at least a fair chance he might be hitting on a 4+. It does feel like damage is going to be paying a big premium for the indirect fire though, and that feels like a bit of a hefty premium to pay for the Breacher Shells that don't have the biggest range in the world. They do kind of feel like, as expected, indirect fire that pays a massive premium for getting the rule, and perhaps are going to be kind of niche in strong lists as a result. Next up we've got the new light skimmers for the Votann, the Kapricus Carrier and Defender. These ones are basically upscale sort of land speeder style versions of the Hearthfyre Pioneer's Grav Trikes, crewed by one driver with a gunner on the back that can be an Ironkin model if desired. Again, the price from Games Workshop seems to be pretty much as expected, around £37 or $60. Like the Steeljacks, the Kapricus gets different rules based on its different loadouts. The carrier version is 75 points printed, and this one acts as a transport vehicle for the Hearthfyre Jaegers. Like the Sagittori gets to split a unit of them in half, 5 of them get to deploy on the board with their infiltrate rules, and 5 of them start in here. The model's got a firing deck of 5, so they can all shoot out with their small arms. For its stat line, the vehicle moves 12 inches with a toughness of 7, 7 wounds and a 4+ armor save, so certainly not standout tough. I'd say kind of mid durability for the 75 points there. It has leadership 7 and OC 2, so not too much weight on objectives. It can scout forward 9 inches, so it can basically put another unit plus another small unit of Hearthfyre Jaegers into the mid-board basically straight away. And otherwise for keywords and things, it does have the fly keyword, has the Hearthfyre keyword relevant for their detachment, and both this and the defender get the smoke keyword for free as well. For weapons and wargear, it has similar kind of firepower to the Hearthfyre Pioneers, 2 Magnacoil autocannons, 3 shots at strength 7, AP 1 and damage 2, one of them with the twin links keyword for the one that's at the front of the vehicle, and has a few armoured hull attacks in melee. The special rule is the scanner uplinks one. Basically after shooting, one unit that gets hit by its attacks, excluding monsters and vehicles, gets suppressed, and it's -1 to hit until the start of your next turn. Not too bad on a unit that's probably going to be moving forward and is kind of expendable. Overall, I feel like this one's interesting enough if you are taking a Jaeger unit anyway. It's often a good idea to have at least some infiltrators in a unit, and a squad of 5 of them can do the infiltrating screening thing just as well as a unit of 10. it's maybe not the worst idea in the world to make that forward deployment squad an absolutely tiny one that's split in half, and then have the other half of them move up as a second wave. That's 2 units that could do screening actions or camp on objectives. So it does feel like you're gaining a bunch more annoying small unit utility by taking one of these if you are taking some Jaegers. I feel like at first impressions it'd probably be just one or none of these. Probably 1 unit of Jaegers to start in the midboard, and then with the optional expansion of one of these to split that unit, unless you wanted to take more for theme of course, you could take lots as it is dedicated transport. Overall certainly seems interesting enough though, for a small skirmishing unit that's a different alternative to the Ironkin Pioneers. For the non-transport variant though, there's the Kapricus Defender. This one doesn't have any transport capacity at all, but instead mounts a more powerful gun on the back. You can take either 1 or 2 of these in a unit, 70 points for one of them or 140 per 2. Again, he gets the twin autocannons on the front, and then you've got the choice of either a boosted high-las rotary cannon or a Magna rail cannon. The high-las rotary one has damage 2, so 6 attacks at 24 inches, strength 6, AP 1, damage 2, and sustained hits 1. Nice enough for clearing out lighter infantry or space marines. The Magna rail cannon feels like the one to go for though to me. A single really big punchy shot, hitting at a mighty strength 14, AP 4, and damage D3 plus 3. And having the devastating wounds and heavy keywords feels like there's just more chance of that doing something meaningful. Interestingly, the special rule for this one is a skirmishing one. After the unit is shot in your shooting phase, it can make a normal move of d6 inches, and it can't make a charge move after that. I guess in theory, if you had room on the board with good space behind ruins, you could make these pretty frustrating to catch up with, have them just peek around the side of ruins by an absolute fraction of the vehicle's hull, then shoot with it, and then use the d6 inches to move back to safety. I guess you might not get very far if you only get 1 inches, but it seems like there's at least some chance you'd be able to peek out, shoot something meaningfully, and then hide. Again, definitely seems like it has options. At 70 points, it's fairly cheap, fast, and expendable, and could be another rival for Ironkin Pioneers and their battlefield role. Next up, we've got the new characters. First up, there's the Arkanyst Evaluator. This one's the Votann mad scientist guy, field testing some exotic weapons, and this one's brought along a transmatter inverter. He's got a whole bunch of lenses to record the effects of his gun on the enemy, and has a fun head swap with some sort of biker goggle style things. For how he functions in game, he basically acts as a sort of pseudo lone operative. He can't join units, but he gets the lone operative keyword if he remains within 3 inches of them, so ideally wants to be paired with some infantry units and try and remain safe. For his printed cost in the book, he is 65 points, and is a 4 wound character with a toughness 5, a 3+ save, and OC 1. And interestingly enough, it looks like that transmatter inverter can go up with a big bang. It has deadly demise 1. For the gun's main effects, it has 3 different profiles, which basically depends on how much you want to push your luck. I feel like it'd be rarely worth it to fire at the half charge profile, but at full charge you have the hazardous keyword, 3 shots out to 18 inches at strength 8, AP 2 and damage 2, though rapid fire 2 to get 5 shots within 9. Though really it feels like the big value profile is on the overcharge mode. That one gets you 3 shots out to 24 inches or a big 6 shots to 12, hitting on a 2+, and all at strength 8, AP 3 and damage 3. So really quite a big punchy profile that's going to take down some elite infantry pretty well. With overcharge mode though, you've got a very good chance of dealing hazardous damage to yourself. You have to take a hazardous roll and he subtracts 2 from the test. So basically he takes 3 mortal wounds on a 1, 2 or 3, leaving him on just 1 wound remaining. Still though, even if he's got a pretty reasonable chance to just fry himself quite quickly, a couple of well converted volleys with that big gun could destroy a lot of elite infantry very quickly indeed. It does seem like a fun profile. For his special rule, he has the option to sacrifice a yield point to gain sustained hits 1 on his gun. Not the biggest damage buff in the world, it might on average lead to 1 extra hit with the overcharge mode. If his shooting actually destroys an enemy unit outright though, you gain 2 yield points. So if he is looking like he's going to be trying to finish off an enemy unit and he's quite likely to succeed, it could be one way to farm some more of them. Overall feels like if he is 65 points and now we know that he's 4 wounds and not going to one-shot himself, that does feel like enough value. I feel like these guys could reap a heavy toll on enemy units, provided they're able to shoot on full effect and aren't doing things like dying to Overwatch or getting countercharged too easily. It could definitely be a big deal as to whether or not the opponent's in a place to be able to hit them back. Next up, we've got the Memnyr Strategist, the Ironkin character with his plug-in brains. He's got the main guy in a sort of thinking pose, and then a whole bunch of additional Ironkin brains plugged into his cognitar mantle, and holding some complicated plans with his extra arms. Printed in the Codex, he's listed at just 45 points, so quite a cheap support character. He's a 4 wound character with a 4+ save. He can only join the 2 versions of the Ironkin Steeljacks units, and basically does almost nothing in actual combat. Just 1 attack with a bolt pistol at range and 1 attack in melee. It's his special rules that sell him though. He's got his Computational Mastermind one, and that basically allows you to raise or lower your yield score by 1 yield point, and that's done at the end of your command phase before determining your army rule for each objective marker that has a model with this rule on it. The most obvious thing there just seems to have him camping on the home objective, and basically means that you could boost the yield score by each point for all the detachments that are hungry to expend the points. At 45 points you could just have him completely solo and just trust that the opponent doesn't have any indirect fire and keep him hidden. Otherwise could maybe have him with some ranged Steeljacks and laying down some fire support. He does allow the Steeljack units to either overwatch for free, which is quite nice with the boosted overwatch, or heroic intervention for free, which could be alright with the melee ones. Some enhancements could be pretty interesting just for a unit that you need to keep safe somewhere on the board, and he does have some specific things in some detachments too. Overall he seems interesting enough. I feel like him with a bunch of the Arkanyst Steeljacks seems fun. Finally, for the new units, we've got Buri Aegnirssen. He is the named character and the last surviving member of his league, wiped out by the Tyranids in a callback to the original squat lore maybe, though he's obviously come back fighting, bearing relics of his league with a great big dark star glaive called Bane, wearing a Tyranid prime across his back, and due to being thrice devoured has got a whole bunch of fun bionics, and is ready to take the fights to more Tyranids. He was really quite a well received miniature when they unveiled him, maybe the single most popular Leagues of Votann model looks wise so far out of any of them. It seems that his price is a little bit cheaper than some epic heroes that Games Workshop comes out with at £26 or $42. For his rules, his Codex printed points cost is 110 points, and for that you get a punchy lone operative. His toughness 6 with a 3+ save and a 4+ invulnerable and 5 wounds, and is a lone operative with the stealth keyword as well, so not very easy to get shots on him in the first place. Just on his base profile before his resurrection things though, is maybe not crazy standout tanky if you can deal damage to him. As you guess by his model, his melee is very punchy indeed. He gets 5 attacks at strength 12, AP 3 and damage 3, all with precision, so no need to expend any command points on epic challenge there, or can swap about for sweep attacks, 10 attacks at strength 6, AP 2 and damage 1 if he's fighting hordes. He does have a bolt pistol as well if he needs to do just the tiniest bit of ranged fire. His special rules are both really good ones for his battlefield role though. Grudge Fueled Fortitude allows him to resurrect on death. The first time he's destroyed you roll a dice, or a 2+ he stands back up again with 4 wounds remaining, as close as possible to where he was before, but outside of engagement range at the end of the phase. It means that if the opponent decides to charge and kill him, they might well do so, but he'll get back up most likely and charge back at them the next turn. His other special rule is kind of intimidating as well. Unhinged Vengeance gives him a d6 plus 2-inch surge move once per enemy shooting phase. If he's shot and he loses a wound, then he moves that far directly towards the closest enemy unit, and he can use that to get in melee if he wants to. It only works if he's not in engagement range and isn't battle shocked. It means that you can't really chip damage off him safely. If you do, then he's going to jump into melee, and due to the order of where you can pick units to activate in the fight phase, he'll likely be able to hit first, unless the opponent's got something else to countercharge with him. Overall just makes him a bit of an awkward prospect to be able to approach. You can't shoot him outside of 12 inches, but if you get too close and shoot him, he might just throw himself into combat with you. Overall feels like really quite a fun collection of rules. Definitely enough damage to be really quite impactful. Hard to deal with between his lone operative and the 2+ resurrect on death, and the surge move makes things more complicated. Certainly looks like it'd be a lot of fun, maybe his biggest weakness being that 5-inch movement that he has. If the opponent isn't right at hand, he might be having to try and make some long charges or exposed out in the open, maybe more so than certain other equivalent lone operatives in other factions. Moving past the new units though, let's talk about all the existing roster of Votann units, starting with the squads, then going through to the vehicles and characters. For the base troops of the army, we've got the Hearthkin Warriors. In 10th edition, they've maybe tended to be slightly placeholder skirmish units, not really very big on the damage or defense, but useful to have in Sagittars for small units with a good amount of OC and the sticky objectives rule. They still keep their sticky objectives rule intact here, so nice to mark the home field objective with that to give you options later in the game, and certainly aren't bad units to have skirmishing over the mid-board ones, being a good balance for expendable and high OC. Overall, they feel like they're going to be fairly similar in role. They still have the same stat line. 1 wound models at toughness 5 with a 4+ save and OC 2. Their Feel No Pain has now been built in as a core ability now. I guess that represents the med pack as it's no longer listed as an individual war gear item. I guess that's a small advantage, so you get the Feel No Pain whether or not the specific guy with the med pack is still alive or not. It does seem they've decided to consolidate more of their war gear bits though. They no longer have the chance to regenerate command points from the comms array, though they didn't really tend to be the biggest target for stratagems in the first place. And they also no longer ignores cover with their shooting from the scanner. Instead, that's been incorporated as another datasheet rule. Panspectral scanning just gives you reroll hit rolls of 1 for the entire unit, so again that would mean that it would affect the entire squad regardless of where the model with the scanner happens to be in one split unit or another. Otherwise, most of their weapons have the same sort of style of feel. They all have to choose between bolters or ion blasters. Then they get 2 fancy special weapons in the unit, and the Thane gets a bit of boosted gear as well. For changes, the Thane's pistol has been consolidated into a single shot one at strength 8, AP 2, damage 1 with 12-inch range. So you'd use that profile whether it's the plasma or the ion one that's modelled. It looks like you can now mix the ion blasters and bolters within a unit, so you could have half and half if you wanted to. I suspect that most people would want to go one or the other though. And otherwise the other melee weapons have been a bit more restricted. Only the Thane gets the kin melee weapon profile with a damage of 2 now. The other 2 are downgraded to plasma knives, but if you want, those plasma knives can now replace other things in the unit like ion blasters or bolters, and you still get the heavy weapons, so you could have them alongside plasma beamers and highlights weapons if you wanted. Seems like a bit of a side grade though, trading their small arms for an alright melee attack that still isn't all that standout. Overall doesn't enormously feel like their role's going to change too much in the Codex. They're still going to be good draw to having at least one unit of them with the sticky objectives. I feel like Sagittars are going to be tempting to split the unit still. Good to have in small numbers, but probably not great to have loads of. Next up, we've got the Ironkin Steeljacks. They're 90 points for a unit of 10 of them, and their Codex printed cost stays the same. They're the infiltrating leagues of Votann. Always pretty good value to have one unit of infiltrators in an army to be able to claim the midboard, stop enemy scouts or infiltrators, and do early game objectives. They move a little bit faster, have a 5+ save, get a reactive move of d6 inches when the enemy gets too close, which is quite a nice datasheet rule as they go. And then either have a bunch of AP2 plasma knife attacks in close combat, or some bolt shotgun attacks that they can advance and shoot, both of which feel like they're alright really, plus a couple of special weapons. Broadly speaking, they're one of the least changed datasheets out of the entire Codex. The only thing that changed for them was a boost in range both of the bolt revolvers and also the shotguns. Still feels like there's going to be some good draw to them, laying claims to the midboard and allowing things like Ironkin Pioneers to scout up, and it could be interesting for the split option that they could have to have a Kapricus split them into 2 small units, a 5-man squad doing the infiltrating business in the midboard, and then another 5-man one in a transport to follow up. They still strike me as a unit that you'd probably want one copy of, and often not more or less. Next up, we've got Terminator's Votann style in the Ironkin Hearthfyre. Pre-Codex they were 150 or 320 points, though their Codex printed cost has them lower than this at 135 or 270, which does feel like it could reflect changes to their datasheet. On a per model basis it does feel like they've got worse. They're not quite as tough as they used to be, toughness 5 down from T6, and they no longer have the inbuilt -1 to wound rule with a character. I guess you could still get that with Fortified Takeover though. The only bit that has increased for durability is the Weaverfield Crest can give a 5+ invulnerable save to the entire unit if you like it, though even that's going to be a little rarely triggered. If they've got 2+ saves, you need very high AP to get onto that invulnerable. Otherwise, for the damage and defense, they still remain a 2 wound unit with a 2+ save, at least somewhat sturdy but not notably so, and particularly 2 spammed damage 2 weapons, they can get cut down quite quickly. At range they have a grenade launcher, which has got a little worse, with D3 shots at strength 3, AP 0, damage 1, rather than D6 at strength 4. And then the choice of an Etakan plasma gun or a Vulcanite disintegrator, both of which got a little better. The plasma gun now has 2 shots at strength 7, AP 3, damage 2 at 12 inches. It gained rapid fire 1, which it didn't have before, and the Vulcanite disintegrator has gained a bit of range. It's now 24 inches with some spam strength 5 shots with devastating wounds. Previously I would have been more tempted by the Vulcanite, though after the plasma update feels like that could be the more tempting out of the pair of them. Then in melee they have either concussion gauntlets for some mid-strength and damage 2 attacks, that dropped down in strength a little bit, it was strength 9 and now is strength 8, or plasma blades for strength 6, AP 2 and damage 1, I'd still probably go with the concussions out of those. The Thane's weapon has been rebranded as a graviton hammer from a concussion hammer, and this gets some nice anti-keywords, anti-monster 3+, and anti-vehicle 3+, all at strength 9, AP 1 and damage 3, so I guess nice enough to have a fairly direct boost against really tough things hidden within the unit. Finally, for their datasheet rule, to replace the -1 to wound thing, it now gets 2 reroll hit rolls of 1 at range when targeting the closest enemy unit. It does feel like a quite disappointing one, neither particularly strong nor interesting, and I feel like that sort of thing could have been better just on the datasheet stats if they wanted them to shoot harder. I'm not sure why with the Codex, but they just seem to have baked reroll hit rolls of 1 into a whole bunch of unit datasheets, which seems like a fairly odd design decision. Overall, they've had a lot of changes that ultimately don't feel crazy different to how they want to operate, still having a good mix of threat between range and melee, the plasma guns looking more threatening than they were. If they have an appropriate points cost, they could still be a very strong unit. It certainly does feel like they'd have to cost less than they did previously though. Feels like the 135 points feels alright. I don't think anyone was really hoping that they'd get less good but also cheaper though. Perhaps one of the units that feels like more of a winner out of the Votann roster are the Chthonian Berserks. These Space Dwarf shock troops with their big hitting melee weapons have got slightly punchier, though it has been somewhat of a side grade, dropping down to 1 wound from 2. The durability is maybe overall more of a side grade than a straight downgrade. They had 2 wounds but now they have 1, but to take the edge off that, they've been upgraded to a toughness of 6, so a few things won't wound them as well. They've got a save of 5+ rather than 6+, so against low AP attacks a few more of those won't go through. And they've also had their Feel No Pain upgraded from a 5+ to a 4+, and again that'll lead to a few more saves than they otherwise would have made. They still ultimately feel like they're going to be a unit that's more threatened by small arms than they were before though, and less chance of a 2 wound model surviving with some lucky Feel No Pain rolls. For their damage profiles, their main thing are their melee weapons. The biggest thing feels like their concussion gauntlets. They were previously 3 attacks hitting on a 4+ at strength 9, AP 2 and damage 3. Now they've dropped down to just strength 5, AP 2 and damage 3, but they've gained really big hitting anti-monster and anti-vehicle 3+ keywords. So basically it means it's a profile that's still going to be doing absolutely fine against the majority of infantry, just having a blind spot against infantry and bikes and things that are toughness 6 or 7, but absolutely going to be massively stronger against monsters and vehicles, wounding a lot of them on a 3+ where they would have been a 5 before. It seems pretty punchy that you could have a unit with 15 attacks at that kind of profile, wounding monsters and vehicles on a 3+, that's going to cause a whole load of pain. The heavy plasma axes are a similar sort of choice now rather than a very different one. They basically get the same profile but with no anti-keywords but upgrading the strength to 7, so they'll be a bit better against things that are toughness 3, toughness 5, 6 or 7, but massively worse against monsters and vehicles. It still doesn't seem awful, though I feel like the trade-off just probably isn't worth it. I'd rather have the strength 5 and the anti-keywords, just for how utterly devastating that makes them against the really tough stuff. Finally, their concussion gauntlet profile has been shifted very slightly. That previously had AP 1 for some reason. It's been upgraded to AP 2 with 4 attacks that are twin linked. That one still doesn't seem bad given the wound rerolls. Could maybe be an option to give the unit a few more volume attacks, usable against more mid-strength infantry, and more attacks against lighter stuff. Though I wouldn't be surprised to see people going for mass mauls. Finally, for the datasheet, they still have their Maul grenade launcher, though it's been quite significantly toned down. Its range is shorter, it hits on a 5 rather than a 4 for some reason, and its debuff rule has been made worse as well. It now turns off enemy overwatch rather than slows down enemy units. In theory that could be quite a good debuff, though usually by the time you've got to the shooting phase you've already moved around all your units, and most enemy units will have already had the opportunity to fire overwatch if they wanted to. It could prevent things for your next turn, but that's going to be thinking quite a way in advance. Finally, for their special rule, they also have cyber stims. That allows them to fight on death on a 4+, getting a small buff to that, adding 1 to the roll if Fortified Takeover is active. Overall, they still seem solid. Looks like they're going to be absolutely murderous damage against monsters and vehicles now with those anti-keywords going. Even with the other defensive side grades though, it still feels like their durability is going to be lower than it was. At least kind of resistant to small arms with the toughness 6 and the boosted Feel No Pain, but I think they're going to miss the 2 wounds. I could certainly still see units of 5 of these jumping out of Sagittars being a good idea though. Next up, for another unit that's also looking really quite dangerous but also less durable than the Codex, are the Brokir Thunderkin. Pre-Codex there were 80 points for 3 or 160 points for 6 of them. The Codex printed cost is now 85 or 170. Firstly, as mentioned again, their durability has been dropped for some reason. They went down to 2 wounds from 3. It does seem like a curious decision to make the majority of the Votann roster just not really all that tough. It feels like for Ironkin Hearthfyre, these guys and the Chthonian Berserks, they've all got more slanted to damage rather than defense. The damage output for these guys though certainly has been upgraded in a big way. All 3 of their guns got more dangerous. The bolt cannons got sustained hits 2 rather than sustained hits 1. They still seem like the worst option though. Both of the other guns seem like really nice profiles though. The Graviton blast cannons got huge upgrades. They now have a 24-inch range when they previously had the downside of range 18 inches, a flat 3 attacks and losing blast, so a few less attacks against massed up infantry I suppose, but they have compensated for that by getting a damage of 3. Quite importantly as well, they're also good against monsters now. They previously just had anti-vehicle 2+, but now it's anti-vehicle and anti-monster 3+, and particularly with a damage of 3, that's going to be a really punchy gun that's good at taking down enemy heavy hitters. It's quite a similar profile to the Chthonian Berserks. There are going to be a few targets they're not so hot against with toughness 6 or 7, but against most everything else they should be immensely dangerous. Finally though, their SP conversion beamers look like they're a good combo sort of weapon. Still 24-inch range, now they have 2 shots rather than 1 out to that range, all hitting at strength 7, AP -2 and damage 3. The AP was boosted. They've traded their sustained hits D3 for lethal hits and still have the conversion keyword, which means that if they hit the enemy on a 4+, then it becomes a critical hit if the target is greater than 12 inches away, as conversion weapons have more power against things that are further. That means that they could be auto-wounding tough stuff really quite well with those good punchy profiles. And perhaps more importantly than that, there's a few ways that they can get sustained hits, like the transport detachment or the stratagem from the Needgaârd detachment. You could potentially have sustained hits too on these guys with a couple of different ways. So every 4, 5 or 6 they roll essentially gets 2 hits and an auto wound. So really quite brutal if you can keep them in effective range. Overall, looks like 2 pretty awesome profiles there. They have lost their Overwatch on a 5+. I guess it's the Ironkin that made off with that rule. The one they swapped to isn't too bad though. Instead they have a strips cover rule called Breaching Fire. So one unit that they've hit can basically be marked and the rest of your army can shoot at that unit as if they had Ignores cover. That does seem genuinely very meaningful for amping up the rest of the gun line or even other units of Thunderkin. Overall, unless they increase their points cost by really quite a big amount, these guys are looking seriously quite scary. Even more so than before though, they're just not really going to be very durable on the counter-attack, basically having a standard intercessor style profile with toughness 6, lots of things are going to kill that quite easily. Next up we've got the Grav Trikes that are the Hearthfyre Pioneers. Pre-Codex they were 90 points for 3 of them, printed in the Codex they're 80 points for 3 or 160 for 6. It does feel like they've had slightly more nerfs than buffs. Their stat line's still the same, they're still Grav Trikes with 3 wounds at toughness 6 with a 4+ save, they still scout 9 inches, and their primary weapons are the Magna Coil autocannons, a flurry of shots at strength 7, AP -1 and damage 2, and then supplemented with a heavy weapon, likely a high-las rotary cannon for a bunch of sustained hits at damage 1. It doesn't really feel like the unit's changed in hugely meaningful ways, just a whole bunch of small tweaks to various bits. The bolt revolvers and the shotguns gain a bit of range. The ion beamer alternative weapon profile for the high las has a different profile. It's now D3+1 shots with blast at strength 8, AP 2 and damage 1. Maybe a little bit more arrival for the rotary cannon, though I'd still say that's probably the better one. The return to reserves rule that they have is still a good one. It's just been tweaked slightly, so now that the unit has to be wholly within 9 inches of the board edge, they can't be chained out, so there's just one unit just nosing within 6 inches like they could before. And then unlike the Hearthkin Warriors, they've kept all of their individual war gear things with the searchlight scanner and the comms array. 2 of them have been changed though. The scanner no longer gives you innate ignores cover, it's now reroll 1s to hit, which I'd say isn't quite as good a buff, particularly on those AP1 autocannons. The searchlight I guess has been mildly buffed, it now allows you to ignore hit roll modifiers for any ranged attacks and not just ones from stealth. It looks like the big bike that previously got the extra wound as well no longer gets the extra wound despite having the extra gunner on it. That's maybe a little bit on the sad side of things. It looks like that's the same as the Chthonian Berserks, which I forgot to mention when I talked about their datasheets. It looks like having the extra Ironkin on the base for the Mole Grenade launcher no longer gives you an extra wound and attack. Finally, it does look like their melee gained a little bit of AP. Their plasma knives are now striking at strength 4 AP 2 as opposed to strength 4 AP 0. With all the changes, it does feel like they're not quite as punchy as they used to be. I feel like losing built-in ignores cover was quite a big one, and their battlefield role could often be trying to hunt down an easy judgment marked unit so they could give the army the command point rerolls. I guess that won't be a thing that you need to do quite so much anymore. If they have dropped down to 80 points though, then I guess they're tankier for the cost and a bit more efficient for doing utility and expendable style things. Certainly still feels like they'll be a relevant unit. Could be nice in the Hearthfyre detachment. I guess they might quite like the ignores cover debuff that the Thunderkin could offer. Moving on to the Votann vehicles and transports now. Next up we have the Sagitaur. These things tended to be spammed in good numbers in Leagues of Votann army lists. Pre-Codex they cost 115 points. The Codex printed points are 95. Again, that seems like it could be pretty plausible to be somewhere close to the final value, given that they have taken some nerfs. In any case, for the points investment, whatever it turns out to be, you get a 9 wound transport. It moves 12 inches and can transport 6 models. It could be good for a fighting squad of Chthonian Berserks, or splitting a Hearthkin Warrior squad in 2 so you have one cheap unit for a backfield objective, and then it could convey some others to the mid-board to take them with their OC. Pre-update they could scout 6 inches, which was quite a good rule to have on a dedicated transport. Nice to be able to get cheap squads into the mid-board straight away, or gain early lines of sight with the high-las cannons. Now though that's no longer a thing, I must admit I wasn't too surprised that went away due to them releasing a scout transport. It just feels a bit more natural that that would probably have that than this. For its durability, it dropped down from toughness 10 to toughness 9, relevant for a few weapons including melter weapons and strength 10 missiles. And then for its weapons, all of them basically changed in some way or another. If you go for the beam cannons, they no longer have the big sustained hits D3, which is a downgrade. They do get D6+1 damage though, rather than D6, so any hits that go through are punchier. They're certainly not quite as threatening as they used to be though. The missiles now both get 36 inches range, both the L7 missiles and the Sagitaur missile launcher. The Sagittor got dropped down to strength 10 from strength 12 though. It's basically quite a direct trade-off of anti-tank damage versus an extra shot now. The Matter Autocannon, which was the rarely taken third option, got buffs. It now has the assault keyword, so you can advance and shoot it, and that would work quite well with the Sagittor's datasheet rule. And it also got sustained hits 1, so it's going to be getting a few more attacks out of that strength 7 and damage 2 that it has. Feels like with the other rules it probably gained a bit on the competitors. Finally, it has its twin bolt cannons on the front for a bunch of strength 6, AP 1 and damage 2. That gains sustained hits too, like the Thunderkin ones. Again, a fair few small changes there. Overall, the datasheet does feel less powerful than it was, so I feel like a points decrease if it went down to 95 seems fairly appropriate. Losing scouts did seem like quite a big loss to value, and losing the sustained D3 was quite a big deal for the high las beams. Still feels like there's going to be overall enough to make it good value though. At least per point it's more durable than it used to be before, even with the toughness loss, presuming it does indeed cost fewer points. That seems like a good unit to have Hearthkin jump out of, or particularly Chthonian Berserks to hit the enemy very hard in melee. Could be nice in the transport detachment of course as well. Next up, for another big datasheet with a whole ton of changes, we've got the Hecaton Land Fortress. This was 225 points pre-update, and the Codex printed points are the same. This one's got the big sort of Land Raider-esque stats, a 10-inch move with toughness 12, a 2+ save, and a big 16 wounds, and then really quite a lot of firepower. All the primary weapons got changes. Maybe the single most interesting one is the Rail Cannon getting buffed. It now gets 2 shots rather than 1 at that strength 18 and AP 4 profile. Its damage output is very slightly less at d6 plus 4 rather than d6 plus 6, but given you're getting 2 shots out of it, then that's way better. The Cyclic Ion Cannon for some reason was nerfed. It dropped down to d6 plus 2 shots and strength 7. Not sure why that was the case, as it didn't tend to get taken as much. And the Conversion Beamer gets a similar sort of change to the Thunderkin. More shots base, though it doesn't get sustained hits anymore, it gets lethal hits. Again, could potentially be interesting for anything that could grant it sustained hits, like the Needgaârd detachment. Feels like it's between that one and the Rail Cannon for the top mounted gun. Otherwise for changes, the Matter Auto Cannons gain the sustained hits warrant and assault that they did on the Sagittor, the Bolt Cannons gain sustained too, and there's the new Ion Beamer profile. It feels like maybe the choice between the Warhead and the Scanner is a little bit closer than it used to be. Previously it allowed the Hecaton Land Fortress to ignore cover, now it's reroll hit rolls of 1 once more. I still guess the rerolls are probably going to be worth it overall, given that they affect a whole bunch of profiles for multiple turns. You could front load the damage with a bunch of strength 7, AP 2 and damage 2 though if you'd like. The Warhead did lose its indirect fire though. Its special rule got changed around. Previously it gave you reroll wound rolls for things jumping out of it, so it's quite good for buffing Hearthguard shooting. Now instead it just gets baked in, ignores modifiers to ballistic skill and the hit roll, so shouldn't be hitting worse than a 4+ at least. That'll definitely help out against some targets. And finally its transport capacity was buffed slightly. It's gone up to a transport capacity of 14 rather than 12, and also exoframes only take up 2 slots, so it means that you could now have an entire unit of exoframes with a Brockier Ironmaster in there, all ready to jump out and hit the enemy very hard with those boosted guns. Overall, lots and lots of changes there. It feels like it'd be sad to lose some supporting rules where the ignores cover, but its transport got better, a lot of its base gun stats got a fair bit better, and still seems like it's going to be a good focal unit for stratagems and working with things jumping out of it. I certainly still guess that these guys would be a staple in the army. Finally, we've got the Votann characters. First up, there's the Carl at 70 points, the standard Votann Captain style HQ, still able to lead either Ironhin Hearthguard or Hearthkin Warriors. He's a 4 wound character with a 3+ save, and gets the choice between either a Combi Bolter or Vulcanite weapon, and then a Plasma Axe versus Mass Gauntlet in melee. A bit of personal threat either way round. The Vulcanite weapon gained some range, the Mass Gauntlet gained a bit of AP, and probably cements that one as being firmly in the lead with 3 attacks at strength 8, AP 3 and damage 3. For his unit, he still grants lethal hit, probably a fair bit more useful for the Ironhin Hearthguard, and could be quite nice for plasma guns if they're going to be more popular than before. His buffing rules do feel a bit wasted on Hearthkin Warriors unfortunately. And then his second special rule that previously handed out judgment tokens now has a potential to farm yield points. I'd say not in a particularly helpful way though, as you only generate them when you destroy enemy units with his squad. It's hopefully going to happen if he is leading a big squad of Hearthguard, though not quite as reliably as just generating them in some way. Overall, I feel like how good he is going to depend on the Ironhin Hearthguard in quite a big way. If they're cheap enough to be efficient with those plasma guns and the overall damage combo is going to be worth it, then maybe he'll get a look in. Even for that role though, he will be competing against the Ironhin champion. Before getting to him though, we've got the named Carl in Uthar the Destined. He was 80 points previously, and his Codex printed cost is the same still. Again, he can lead Hearthkin Warriors or Ironhin Hearthguard. He gets the Vulcanite Disintegrator and a fairly punchy melee attack, 5 attacks at strength 6, AP 3 and damage 2 with devastating wounds. His ancestral fortune was made a bit more costly. Previously he could flip either hits or wounds to a 6 automatically, not too bad for hitting with some devastating wounds in melee. Now he can do that to a save as well, but to activate it you have to spend a yield point, so it might be a bit of a big ask if you're in a detachment that isn't actively trying to get rid of them. I guess the value could be worth it though if it does save his life. It could effectively allow you to blanket damage against something big and scary like a multi-melter or las cannon and maybe give him one more turn of acting. For his other special rule though, he got a very different one. Previously he reduced damage to 1 of things that were attacked at him, making him slightly weirdly tanky against the wrong sort of firepower. Now though it seems that his grim efficiency adds a bit of command point manipulation for the leagues of Votann nearby. Once per battle round, when a friendly Votann unit within 12 inches uses a stratagem, you reduce the command point cost of that stratagem by 1. That by itself just makes him into a very interesting datasheet, particularly when you could be putting that on big scary things like say nearby Brokir Thunderkin or Hekaton Land Fortresses. Discounted stratagems on very powerful units seems very nice. Maybe it could be an option to have him hiding with a unit of 5 Hearthkin on a home field objective, using that big stratagem aura to help out your damage dealers nearby. And then after a few turns of doing that, or if the enemy gets too close, he could countercharge and put his melee damage to some good work. Overall, I feel like that special rule is enough to turn him around a bit. I think it'll be now quite a tempting model to have at the heart of the army. Next up, we've got the Ironkin Champion, the big exo-armoured brawler. He's toughness 5 with 5 wounds and a 2+ save, and can have a 4+ invulnerable save if he takes the Weaverfield crest. For his weapons, he hits very hard indeed, so he attacks at strength 12, AP 3 and damage d6+1 with his mass hammer, or swapping out for some mass damage 2 with the Darkstar axe. Both of those got some slightly boosted AP. It does feel like in the post-judgment token world the mass hammer might be yet more tempting, due to the strength 12 not needing the +1 to wound quite so much. For his special rules, he still gains some mortal wound impact hits, usually D3 when he charges into the enemy, and his second special rule has been shifted slightly. While leading a unit he gained +1 to advance and charge rolls, maybe interesting enough for the Ironkin Hearthguard when teleporting in. That means that you could get an 8-inch charge for them out of Deep Strike, and with a command point reroll or your hostile acquisition, that means they could be odds on to make the charge, though it's still not reliable. His printed cost has gone up a little, he's listed at 70 rather than 60, I guess we'll see whether or not that remains to be the case. It does feel like he's gained in value a bit though, if he's got better AP in melee, and that +1 to charges thing could definitely be handy out of Deep Strike. Next up, we've got the Votann Psyker in the Grimnir. The Living Ancestor guy is 65 points, and he gets a 4 wound model and then 2 Corvs alongside him, both of them 1 wound and firing with their Autop pattern bolters. Perhaps the biggest thing that he adds to a unit is Ancestral Wrath, 6 attacks at strength 6, AP -2 and damage D3 as a fairly good shooting attack against medium infantry. And then on top of that he has a few other side benefits, 2 attacks with damage D3 in melee, giving his Hearthkin Warrior unit a 5+ feel no pain, though not the biggest upgrade in the world given that they already get a 6+ at base, and cancelling a Battle Shock effect for 1 unit within 12 inches, triggering at the start of any phase. A bunch of those have had some tweaks. He gets an extra attack in melee now. His previous buff was a +1 toughness. The 5+ feel no pain feels like an alright side grade I suppose, and previously his cancel Battle Shock only affected his own unit, so a bit more general purpose there. As per recent balanced data slate things, his Corvs still don't take up any space in transports, so you could have him with 5 Hearthkin in a Sagittor. He does feel like a bit of a weird unit, in that he's basically one that you take if you want both more damage and more defense in a Hearthkin Warrior unit, but also to cost kind of proportionally more points. He doesn't really feel terrible for what he does, just doesn't feel particularly stand out either. Maybe the main issue is trying to build around the Hearthkin Warriors as a more damage and defense style unit. I feel like you can do, and with his shooting profile he does help them out with that a bit, but putting more points into damage combo units that are already quite good at that might be the better option. Finally, for the Votann character roster, we've got the Brokir Ironmaster, pre-Codex who has 65 points, and in print he is 75. He comes with his entire attendant squad with him, 1 Ironmaster as a 4 wound character, and then 3 ECOGs and an Ironkin assistant, all of which have 1 wound now. The assistant previously had 2. He can lead either Brokir Thunderkin or Hearthkin Warriors, but has also gained the option to gain Lone Operative if he's near either leagues of Votann vehicle units or Ironkin Steeljacks. So you could potentially have him and his little squad out in the open healing things in a similar sort of style to a Tetmarine or Warpsmith. For his buffs, he has a multispectral visor. This one allows him to reroll wound rolls of 1 for ranged attacks made by his unit. Previously it was a +1 to hit. I guess that one had to change due to the core army rule giving +1 to hit out quite so easily. Reroll 1s to wound isn't awful, though maybe has a little anti-synergy with lethal hits, say if he was with some conversion beam Thunderkin. Otherwise, he has his repair rules, regenerating 3 lost wounds to an extra frame or vehicle unit within 3 inches, and you can also target Ironkin Steeljacks with that now. Quite a lot of value if you're able to put that back on a land fortress potentially. His squad gets some small arms and a las cutter and plasma torch. The Iron Master himself became a bit more threat though. He gets 3 attacks at range and melee with graviton weapons, all hitting at strength 5, AP 1, damage 3, and again gets those anti-monster and anti-vehicle 3+ keywords. If the enemy moves up on his position with a monster or vehicle, there's a pretty reasonable chance that this guy himself could deal some pretty meaningful damage to it, particularly if it's out of cover. Overall, between all the things that he can do and having a small squad with him, he certainly feels like he's got enough value to justify himself. He could put enhancements in the Thunderkin unit with him as well. Now he gets Lone Operative. He could be interesting enough just literally as a healing unit if you're taking land fortresses along, and he does have a bit of damage to counter-attack with. It does seem quite nice that he can ride with his squad in a maxed out unit of Thunderkin though. That will be a good way to make the squad both more dangerous and also potentially a fair bit tankier as well, catching some big hits on his 4 expendable minions. That just about brings us to the end of the datasheets though, and wraps up the review for the Codex Leagues of Votann. So far feels like reactions have been a bit mixed. They do often tend to be for 10th edition codexes I find. It does feel like certain units have got less powerful or a bit less exciting, and maybe doubled down on that with there not being judgment tokens on easy standby for +1 to wound. It does feel like one of the criticisms might be that a few of the datasheets might get far cheaper in points and have less threat, which isn't exactly what most people would probably want for Games Workshop to do with them. With so many fun new units though, and a whole bunch of new detachments, a lot of which do seem interesting, I feel like it is going to breathe a bit more life back into the faction. As mentioned for the detachments earlier, it still feels like the Needgaârd Oathband one will be a solid pick. It just adds a lot of very direct power. There's a bunch of cool stuff and shenanigans both for the transport, the Hearthfyre, and the Cthonian Berserk detachment. Feels very fun. I'm not sure how strong it'll be though. I'm currently a bit unsold on the Ironkin Scientist one. For the data sheets, it does feel like a few of them are kind of obvious winners or losers here. I guess for positives, both the Berserks and the Thunderkin are looking rather murderous with their anti-keyword profiles. It's quite nice to have some command point manipulation on the board with Uthar the Destined. A Memnyr Strategist seems like a pretty good idea for maximising yield points sat on a home objective perhaps. And heck is on land fortresses with boosted railguns. Still look like they could be a very solid heavy hitter for the unit, maybe delivering some Thunderkin to the fight. I think I'd still be a bit apprehensive that a bunch of units are really going to be all that good with the points cost I suspect that they're going to give them. The Cthonian Earthshakers and the Steeljacks, I wonder if they're going to be a bit on the mid-side. It doesn't really feel like the Hearthguard have been helped out by that flurry of changes that they had them, but maybe boosted plasma guns and a cheaper points cost could save them. And still feels like certain HQs, like the Grimnir in particular, could be kind of niche. Will be fun to see what people choose to put on the table with them though. Let me know your first impressions of the Codex down in the comments below. Which units and detachments are you most looking forward to putting on the table? I'll leave that there for now though. As mentioned, a big thank you to Toy Snowman for sponsoring the video. If you live over in Canada, then they can do Games Workshop miniatures at 15% off. There'll be links down in the video description. And for other folks around the world, here are the pre-order times when the Leagues of Votann go live this coming weekend. It'll be midnight Eastern time in North America, and then 10 through to midday for the rest of the world. A big thank you to anyone using the channel affiliate links to help support Auspex Tactics. It is very much appreciated. I'll leave that there for now though. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out each day. If you'd like to support the channel more directly, Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to check that out. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link's down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.